Welcome to a special edition of the No Nonsense Roundtable. And now your host, Dom Genova.
Well, gang, last week I was lucky enough to record a fellow from his home in London, Carl Palmer of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They sold 50 million albums in their day. He's one of the most accomplished people I've ever met, and he will be playing here in Rochester on November 3rd. So let's get to it. Okay, so the first question I have is from a fellow who wrote a book with Lou Gramm, who wrote Lou Gramm's biography. And the guy's name is Scott Petoniak, and he asked this question. He says, Dom, he started his musical training as a classical violinist, but switched to drums. I guess there was a seminal moment when he saw a film called Drum Crazy, starring Sal Mineo, and that was life-changing. So I'd ask him about that. And he says, I know his grandfather played drums. I'd be intrigued to know what about that instrument captured his fancy.
Well, the story about, it's really nice, but the story about going to see Drum Crazy or the Gene Krupa story has gone down in print so many times from me. I think we can do better than that for questions. As far as talking about my grandfather, my grandfather did play. He was a drummer. My other grandfather was a professor of music at the Royal Academy. He played violin. And my great-great-grandmother was a classical guitar player. My father played piano and drums. My younger brother is a drummer. Mind you, I say he's younger. He's 65. My nephew is a drummer. So there's a lot of drummers in the family, but there's an awful lot of musicians over the period. So that moment of change for me was I started on the violin, actually started on ukulele first of all when I was young, but they didn't really like me playing that in the house. Moved on to violin because my grandfather taught violin and harmony at the Royal Academy, and that was okay. It wasn't really anything it wasn't a light bulb moment, as it were. When I saw the film Gene Krupa, that was a moment I thought, well, I'd like to try that, and I've walked down that road ever since.
So Felix asked me, first of all, Felix says hello. You know Felix very well, I would imagine.
No, I don't. I've never met him.
Okay, well, Felix was one of the founders of the Rascals.
I know who he is.
Okay.
I know who he is, yeah.
Okay, and he asked you about working in the crazy world with the crazy world of Arthur Brown. Because that's something we're really we're not familiar with that too much here in the States.
Yeah, no, it's gone out many times. I've been asked the question many times. Basically, we had a number one single in 1968 called Fire. And I Am the God of Hellfire was the opening statement on the single. And then Arthur Brown would come out with this fire helmet, which would suddenly burst into flames. You can still see it, and you can find videos of it on YouTube today. It's no secret. It's nothing that's been hidden. It's there and it's available, and it's had many views. So that was my introduction into America. When I was 18, I decided to come over and help Arthur Brown. So I joined the Crazy World. That was the name of the backing group. And I stayed with him for possibly about 18 months, something like that. Might have been less, actually. But the single was huge. I played on various recordings of his. He had lots of drummers go through the group, not through the group, but on the recordings. He had about 4 or 5 drummers. The original drummer was Dracian Theka. I replaced him because I had done a session with Arthur, and then I remained the drummer for all of the period that the group was selling, a large amount of records, and I'm still friends with Arthur today.
Well, you were in 3 groups that were very, very successful. One of the things that impresses me is that when you left Emerson, Lake and Palmer, you went to Asia. It was still phenomenally successful. I mean, that's very odd in your business.
It is. To be honest with you, the group after the Crazy World of Arthur Brown was Atomic Rooster, and Atomic Rooster was a band that I'd formed with Vincent Crane, the keyboard player from the Crazy World. And I formed this band. We were doing really well. Especially in the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Stockholm, you name it. It was really going extremely well for us. And I got the call, from Keith's manager, I believe. And I'd just done some demos with the Atomic Rooster. And one of the demos was Tomorrow Night. The track was called Tomorrow Night. You wouldn't be familiar with it. Anyway, when I decided to jump ship, as they say, and join Emerson, Lake and Palmer, I was in the rehearsal room with them, and Tomorrow Night by Atomic Rooster was #1 in the UK charts. Yes, they'd had to record it again with their new drummer. And of course, at that stage, I thought maybe I'd done something wrong. You know, something was weird. So what is unusual about the story is, which is worth noting, is that I've been in 3 bands that have had #1 singles, ELP and Asia and Atomic Rooster. If you want to count Arthur Brown as well, you could say 4. So quite a good pedigree.
Yeah, to have that type of pedigree is phenomenal. And you know, the thing is, when I talked to people and said I was going to interview you, the people in my audience, because my audience is mainly people our age, I'm about your age too, and they're like, "Oh my God, you're gonna interview Carl Palmer? Wow, that is really cool." And the younger people are like, as you know, they're like, "Who? What?" And they, especially with Emerson, Lake and Palmer, this stuff. My favorite album is Trilogy. I mean, I play this every week. It's still the edition I have from 1970, whatever it was, 75 or 4, whatever. I bought the damn thing. But the depth of the music and the intelligence of the music, to me, is astounding, because you go back into some classical pieces there and you update them, hoedown and whatever, and it's kind of like an homage to your background, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, you have to realize is that the Emerson, Lake and Palmer catalogue is incredibly strong. It's probably one of the strongest at BMG. And it's always been that way. And it is because the music is more in depth, because it's not just one brand. I mean, you might have even done this yourself and called us a prog rock band, but that's slightly limiting to call us a prog rock band. When you think we did use the latest instruments of the time, which made it sort of, progressive. We used the latest synthesizers or Moog synthesizers or whatever the case may be, the GX1. But in actual fact, if you look at what we did, I mean, we did play rock, we did play acoustic songs, we did play folklore music, and we did have classical adaptations, which we then put into a new sort of contemporary way with the instruments of the day. So our music really, to call it just prog rock, is slightly limiting, really, because all of the big singles that we had, apart from Fanfare for the Common Man, which was written by Aaron Copland, all the other singles were very, very pretty sort of ballads from the beginning. Still You Turn Me On, Footprints in the Snow, Lucky Man, C'est la Vie, I Believe in Father Christmas. They were just everyday, great songs. There's nothing prog about them. There might have been some unusual sounds on the record which that made people think that it was prog, but in actual fact they were 3-4 chord songs and just great melodies, great top lines. So we weren't just a prog band, we were quite eclectic, and that was the story, and that's been the everlasting success of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. It's now in a situation where when people go to download something, obviously you're not going to download the whole of Tarkus. You're going to want to take sections of it out, or pictures at an exhibition by Mussorgsky that we recorded. So, from the point of downloads, we don't have as much of that deeper, more in-depth prog music being downloaded, but the songs, like all the instrumentals like Hoedown, like Fanfare, like Lucky Man, you name it, they do get a lot of attention. But the music is very deep, and one still hopes that once people download something like that, they'll investigate the other things like Toccata and Brain Salad Surgery and the First and Second Impression and all those things. So it's just a matter of time, really. It was never a metal band. It was never just a prog band. It was never a rock and roll band. It played a lot of different types of music, but managed to put them under the same umbrella. And that was the trick with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And it was keyboard driven. And the guy sounded like a choir boy rather than a blues singer from the Delta or somewhere. So this was kind of unique in its own way.
We'll be back with more from Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer right after this. We're back with Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Well, you take a look at what you did with the Dave Brubeck tune. How do you say that? The Rondo della Turk?
Rondo alla Turk, yeah.
Yeah. You see what you did with that, and you take this piece, you twist it around, but you don't you give it the homage and you give it the respect that it needs. But it's really, if you hear Dave Brubeck and you hear that tune the way he did it, and then you hear yours, you're like, wow, that's really cool. You know what? You took that essence that he had. You didn't ruin it. You adapted it, and you got to listen to it. It's just brilliant. But then again,
yeah, I agree with you. The only thing I could tell you about that is that album, which is called Time Out, which I believe was one of the very first jazz albums to sell 1 million copies globally. That was the first album that I personally bought when I was 11 or 12, whenever it came out. And it also was one of the very first albums that Keith Emerson bought. So that was the kind of synergy that was running in the band. He had a lot of albums that I'd got and vice versa. And the same with Greg and Keith and Greg and Greg and myself. So Time Out was quite an important album for the two of us. Greg didn't actually have the album, but he knew the piece of music because it's obviously quite well known.
Well, you mentioned something just before. You were saying you played in Europe, and it was I forget what country you mentioned, but there's a difference in musical taste between here in the U.S. and the U.K. I would imagine, and I guess somebody was saying that Pictures in Exhibition wasn't picked up by Atlantic, but it was picked up in England or Europe, and that turned out to be a very big success for you, right?
It was released on the Atlantic label, who we were signed to, and it was a global release. Obviously, there were subsidiary companies around, but it was basically an Atlantic signing, and it went down really well. I mean, it got used in quite a few. It got used in Berkeley as a piece of music for people to analyze and see what we'd done to it, how we'd brought it into this time, this age where we all are now. Well, at the time, that was what we'd done to it with using contemporary instruments, as I mentioned before. It got received well in the UK, mainly because it was recorded here at one of the famous sort of venues. Newcastle City Hall, I think it was, or Town Hall. So, yes, it got received okay. Obviously, there were people, the professors of music or whatever at the various colleges, the London College of Music and the Guildhall of Music and so forth, and other places around England that kind of didn't really buy it, didn't think it was convincing. But at the end of the day, you have to understand that the people that it was aimed at were a lot younger demographic, and it did appeal to them. And what it did do was open up their sort of understanding to orchestral versions of the same piece of music, which I'm sure they went on to play later on and investigate. So, we did a lot for classical music from that point of view, and it distinguished us from most other bands because not many people were adapting classical pieces at the time. The only people I know that were doing that was the French composer and pianist Jacques Lussier, who had a trio, a trio, great pianist, and his trio only played Bach, but in a jazz style. So what we were doing as a group was kind of unique. Saying that, Keith Emerson did dabble in some classical pieces with his group he had prior to Emerson, Lake and Palmer. That was called the Ninth.
Well, I'm very familiar with the Rascals because Gene Cornish is a Rochester guy, so we talk a couple of times a week. Actually, and one of the things he was saying, he says hello to you too, but he says he always pencils you in.
I do know him. I've met him a few times.
Okay,
nice man.
Yes, he pencils you in for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame every time that there's an induction for that, and
that's very nice of him.
Yeah, no, he's a good guy, Rochester guy. I grew up just a couple of miles from where my studio is, and one of the things he was talking about a while back with me was Atlantic Records. He says Atlantic Records took them on because they gave him a studio to work in, and that was really a fantastic advantage for them. And these days, I have a young friend of mine who's a musician. He's got 8 million followers. You probably don't know the fellow, but his name is John Dretto. A great young guy, 25 years old. If you see this guy perform, he seems like Hendrix. I mean, he's just phenomenal. And I was asking him, what should I ask you? And he was talking about labels, and he says it's a lot easier these days. You don't have any overhead. He says you don't have to have somebody publish your label to get heard. He says he does everything online. And so his question was, I think it's a pretty good question. He says, what do you miss about the old days?
I don't really miss anything about the old days, really, because I always like to look forward, And as far as, you're doing everything online yourself, I mean, to be honest with you, if you're selling records on a global level, globally, and people are playing your tracks on the radio in all countries around the world, and not just America, I'm talking on a global level, then you need to have a structure set up where you're collecting that money, where you're getting the PRS, you're getting the GLV, you're getting all of the money that's due to you. And to set that up, you have to be part of different organizations. It's not really something you can do on your own. Downloads can be monitored in the US, but if you want to try and do that in Germany, in Finland, in France, in Belgium, Italy, Spain, you need to be registered, because not all radio stations will have a list and fill it in completely every day and submit it. So you have to sort of have people who are looking out for you to collect the money, which they get paid to do as well. But I'd rather have 50% of something than 50% of nothing. So it is quite a big deal. The music business is extremely complex, and on a global level, yes, you can have a webcam happening in your own bedroom, and you can do your concert every month, and you can eventually get a record deal, which we all know they've done. Yes, you can be an influencer, and you can do this and you can do that. What you have to do then is take that environment and stick it into a concert environment, a live concert environment, and see how many people actually come to the door to see you. If you can make that transition, then that's great. If you start to make that transition and you're selling in volume, you will need to have a setup behind you that collects the money in all of the places, especially if you're dealing with global releases, and you have to deal with a global release if you're an international artist. So I don't miss anything from the past. The only thing that I think the biggest mistake we've ever made is that when we did have people who were downloading, and there was no real track record of what people had done, what they'd taken, and accountants in most of these big record companies liked the idea because it saved them money. They didn't have to have warehouse space to store cassettes or CDs, it would have been at the time, or whatever, or revisited vinyl. It's all online, and that's how we do it. But the accounting was not in place. The technology was in place for the people to get the product. The technology was not in place to get the accounting for that product. So a lot of artists lost a lot of money. That's the only thing that I do regret, is that the actual record companies didn't move fast enough from the principle of point of view of getting the actual accounting to the artists done properly. They lost money as well, so it wasn't a one-way road. It went both ways. But that I do regret. Now it's a lot easier. There's more organization. Everybody's on board. But I would say that we lost about 3 years there where the accounting would have been pretty wild and probably not very accurate. And as you know, various bands like Metallica did take various companies to the courthouse and try and get things sorted out. But, it's just one of those things that happen, and that I do regret. So if there's a regret, it's that.
We'll be back with more from Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer right after this.
Welcome back, my friends. Friday, November 3rd at the theater at Innovation Square in Rochester. The return of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Modern technology reunites this legendary band. Keith Emerson and Greg Lake performing on giant video walls with Carl Palmer and his band live on stage all together. Friday, November 3rd at the theater at Innovation Square, downtown Rochester. Tickets now at elptickets.com. That's elptickets.com.
You're listening to the No Nonsense Roundtable, and we're here with Carl Palmer of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. You do have a reputation of being a very good businessman and managing your business over the years successfully. But now, what is the genesis of that? Is it just a natural thing? I mean, or good advisors? Or
no,
just
I've always been interested in the business. I've felt very sad for a lot of musicians who haven't been paid the right money, haven't collected what they should collect. And, it started, my family are basically 50% musicians and 50% retailers, shop They had shops, they had market stalls, they had everything. So I was brought up in the two areas. I could work in the shop, or I could play the violin or banjo or drums, whatever you choose, but you've got to do one or the other. That was the ethos in the family. But I did work in the shops, and I did enjoy working on the market stall. And we had a couple of stalls, actually, in different markets. And I enjoyed both. So I learned a little bit about business that way with my dad. I used to go buying with him to the various warehouses, when he used to go to buy the goods for the shops or for the store. And when I joined the crazy world of Arthur Brown, I was absolutely on the naive side of the music business, completely naive to what was going on. It was a big learning curve going to America. I met a lot of people who I made friends with, talked to about the business, how this works, how that works, collecting this, collecting that, publishing and whatever, record royalties, contracts and how that works. And I realized that Arthur didn't know very much. And that which he didn't have to know, but he chose not to. He wasn't his interest. Anyway, it was mine, and it started then because I was with a band that had a number one album and single. So I could ask. I think it was the single definitely was number one, Fire. I think the album was about 3 or 4. I could definitely ask a lot of questions because I was in the band, and I just found it very interesting. And it went on from there. So by the time I reached Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I'd put the Atomic Rooster together, which was the band that followed the Crazy World of Arthur Brown, I was already dealing with people like Robert Stigwood, who managed the Cream, who managed the Bee Gees, who managed Lulu, had Grease, had, all of these big sort of huge West End shows, multi-millionaire. And I got the management with his company, with him directly, and I learned more from him because he was really an entrepreneur on the highest level, dealing with those bands. And it went on from there. So by the time I got to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Keith sort of wrote the music, Greg wrote the hits, and I got involved with the business side of it. And we all had our jobs, which we had to do, apart from play our instruments, and that's the way it went. Greg Lake also knew a considerable amount, and he was also very interested. And Keith wasn't interested in the business side. He was the maestro, and he did all the writing of that, all that clever stuff we played. So basically it balanced itself out. So that's where the reputation, that's how it started, and that's where it sort of ended up, and it's sort of carried on today.
So, and back in the day, you had some big shows with a lot of entertainment. I would call it a fanfare, whatever. Now you kind of broke the rules when you started making concerts like that, right? With a lot of visuals and so forth. Wasn't that what you were famous for back when?
Well, I mean, we were famous for having sort of a big stage sets. I mean, there wasn't a lot of video being played then. Right. In those days, we'd have stills up on the screen, and it would be quite in depth. And obviously, then when we added the orchestra and the choir, that was a whole nother leap forward. So that's sort of like. That was a period of Emerson, Lake and Palmer had 2 periods. We had the period where we were basically a group on stage. Then we had like a big production with lots of lights and the lasers and whatever, huge screens hanging up and this and that. And then we moved on and had a 60-piece orchestra join us with a choir and did all of that. Then we went back to a trio with obviously a reasonable stage production still again. And that was just part of what we did. We actually thought that, listening to music is great, but if you can add something to it from a visual point of view, eye candy, I think you call it over there, we thought that would be the right way for us to go. And in some places it worked incredibly well, and a lot of the time people just wanted to see the band. And then you could go to somewhere like Las Vegas, and where you would think they would love all of that, jumping over the organs, having this huge stage production. This was back in the 70s, I'm talking now. But we didn't mean anything in Vegas. I don't know why. But then you get to the East Coast, the West Coast, and, we were big. So it was weird. Some of the stuff translated, some of it didn't. And that's the way it went on. But we just kept trying because we wanted to push the envelope, as they say, and we did.
Which leads me to my next point, which is you're going to be in Rochester, and instead of playing in front of thousands and thousands of people, you have a more intimate setting here. I think the theater holds 700 people. And tell me about it, because this is a new kind of idea that you have. I mean, you're not dealing with an enormous audience, but you are playing with your two partners.
Well, basically, the show that will be in Rochester is the one that we started last November, which is already toured, and we did the show. We did shows in July. It's called The Return of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and basically, what it is in a nutshell, the group back in the day, in the mid-90s, played at the Royal Albert Hall in London. That was a 5-camera shoot on both nights. It was 2 nights. And the audio for both of the nights was recorded separately to the visuals. And it was released on DVD. It was released on Sanctuary. And Sanctuary sold out within about 3 weeks of the release of Emerson, Lake and Palmer at the Royal Albert Hall to Universal. So this sold very, very, very few copies. It was almost thrown away. I would say probably less than 12,000 copies I think we've been paid on. And it probably hasn't sold many more than that. So I recall the event, because the Royal Albert Hall is a 4,500 seater, played it 2 nights, so like 9,000 people over the 2 nights. Obviously it was sold out. And it was a great recording, and the DV ended up being absolutely superb. So what I thought was that it was time to sort of have a look at something like that. I was reminded that I got this by my manager, Bruce Pilato, who's, as you know, is in Rochester. We thought we'd have a look at it. And I got him to have a look at it, first of all, because I didn't want to waste my time. And then I was still very much into having holograms. And we'd already investigated holograms on the West Coast, a Canadian company, an LA company. I'd gone to a show to see, I'd seen Frank Zappa at the London Palladium, which was a hologram show. I'd obviously seen all the Whitney Houston stuff on YouTube and the Ronnie James Dio stuff that we've all seen. And it didn't row my boat, but I thought I'd like to investigate it. My main thing was I didn't think it was honest. And Greg and Keith were always big on technology, like we all were. And so the hologram thing, I thought if I could investigate that, maybe I could get them back on stage with me. Maybe that would ring the bell. After seeing the holograms, not of Greg and Keith, because there were never any made, only of the other people, all the other people I've just mentioned to you, I couldn't really buy it. So, cut a long story short, what I decided to do was take the DVD from the Royal Albert Hall that had been released. I looked at that extensively and started to look at what I could use from those recordings visually and what I could use audio-wise. And if I could make sure the audio would sync up to the visual, which it did anyway because the DVD was released, I could get the other pieces of footage that weren't released because it was a 5-camera shoot, and I could do some editing and we could see what we could actually put together. And we ended up being able to put about 7 tunes together of me actually playing with Greg and Keith. They're on these large screens, like things like Knife Edge, and we're all perfectly in time. I managed to be able to wipe the drums completely because, as I said, all instruments were recorded individually. And it means when you come along to see us, Emerson, Lake and Palmer are being mixed live that night because all the keyboards are on separate track. His vocal, my drums are actually being played then and there onto the recordings of them playing, which is being mixed all together. So that's basically what we have, and that's why we call it the return of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. The Emerson family and the Lake family are involved. I make sure that they get some financial remuneration for this, along with certain parts of the merchandise. So it's all happy days for everyone. And I think Greg and Keith would be incredibly happy because this is them. It's not a hologram. It's not some artist being dressed up like Keith Emerson and miming. and, all this type of stuff. This is real. This is the guys at the best of their game, and this is them on stage with me, and it's the closest you'll ever get to seeing Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And thank God for technology. Technology has been a bit of a savior in my career, whether it be with the art or whether it be bringing back Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which I've managed to do.
We'll be back with more from Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer right after this. We're back with Carl Palmer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Well, Gene gave me another question to ask you, and we're going to go completely off topic here. He says, ask him about his art.
The artwork has been quite successful. I think there's about over 600 canvases been sold since I started doing it. Obviously, all different. They're all they're limited editions. Mainly, we go up to about 100 on some as low as 4 or 5. And averaging about, I would think, 100, 150. That's worked incredibly well. It's the technology of today being used by using LED lights at the end of the drumsticks. And I'm sitting in a dark room, and I play with these sticks, various themes from songs from the past, or various patterns, or various drum intros, or sections of music from the Emerson, Lake and Palmer days, Asia days, and then we basically record it in light, shadows, and reflections, and that forms the art. I started doing it in '73 before these sticks were invented. I used to tie light bulbs to the end of the sticks, a cable down to a battery on the floor, and I used to mime. I couldn't actually play anything, but I realized that the transportation of light and the shadows was something interesting and could become an art form, and it did. And I've been doing it for a long time now with a company called Scene 4. And I think over the years, we've given, I would say somewhere in the region, I don't know exactly, it might be a little more than this, but about $47,000 to various charities via the art.
What you're talking about here, I have this expression, I love musicians more than I love music. Because the thing about musicians is that you're creative. I mean, whether it's something that's unidimensional or multidimensional, you're creative. You're creating. There's something here that wasn't there before you were born. And this thing, I've seen pictures of your art. It really is extraordinarily wonderful in its, well, if you want to call it uniqueness. I mean, the way that you play your drums and the lights, it's never going to be created exactly the same twice.
Well, I mean, to tell you the truth, whatever you've seen would take about, I don't know, probably 6 to 8 hours to produce. And once I'm happy with it and all the color codes are good and it works, then that will finally be a product that will be released as a piece of art and be given the title. And, well, it's got the title anyway before I start because I'm going to play something from a recording that I've made. But those things are very, very difficult to capture because I don't just capture the movement of the light. I might have a red LED light. I might have a yellow LED light in one hand. They're attached to the beads. The tip of the drumstick is the actual light, believe it or not. And by the time I played and those lights, those colors are blended, the actual light, the reflections and the shadows, all of those are created in such a way that I can't duplicate. Even if I played exactly the same, had the cameras in the right space, and there's usually 2 cameras at different shutter speeds, it's not something I can actually recreate. You get it or you don't. It's one of those things. Yeah. And I think that's the magic of it for me, and that's what's kept me doing it over the years. That it's you get given the art. It comes, and you might spend 7 hours and get nothing, but then that last minute, that last 45 hour or whatever, suddenly then it appears. You've got it. Yeah. And God, you wonder how you did that or how it came about. But it's not something that is planned. You can plan how to do it, but you can't plan on how to achieve it, and that's the way it goes.
I can tell by the tone of your voice, it brings you great pleasure to do this. This is cool. I mean, it's something other than the music, which obviously was the way that you made a living. It's great. Hey, so let me.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've released 2 art books. It's not something that I kind of boast about or do a lot of interviews on. And we just, it's something that I've always been keen on, and it's just part of what I do. I mean, there's lots of people doing it now. It's not a secret, but it is art that belongs to this generation today, this world we're living in, because it's all to do with technology. I mean, I couldn't do this before. Number one, because the drumsticks weren't invented. Number two, we didn't have digital cameras. And number three, we didn't have computers. So this was not possible to do then. So I was ahead of the curveball, as you say, over there, and just waiting for time to come along and for me to be able to create this. But there are many people doing it now. The companies that I work with, Scene4, work with guitar players who have a glove on their hand that's got lights in it, and as they move, it causes light, reflections and shadows and things. And so it's something that a lot of people are doing, like all art forms should be. It's there to share, and it's there to have many creators, and it has got. And I just happen to be, I would say, possibly the first.
Well, my listeners are all over the age of 25. Most of them are over the age of 45, 50. So we all know, and we all remember, and we will be there. We will be there. I have to tell you, I'm going to encourage as many young people as possible to go there, because it is timeless. It is timeless, great rock and roll.
Well, you have to remember that you might get some sizzle reels sent to you, or you could ask Bruce. We do hit third generation already. We hit people my age, hit the sons, and then we hit their kids, in 18 and whatever, So we've already younger audiences, younger people coming to concerts. And the simple reason being is because I think their grandfathers or their fathers boasted so much about this group, because, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, worked quite a lot, but only in that first 8 years. That second 8 years, wasn't as successful and probably didn't do as many concerts. But that first 8 years definitely set a blueprint for a lot of bands and a lot of stage sets, shows you see today. So I can imagine that over the years, this has been passed down through generation. And when this project came up that I managed to develop and present, which took about 8 to 11 weeks of editing, by the way, to get everything on film the right way, because I had to take myself out of it, so you couldn't see me on the screen with the guys. Only me in where I'm playing my drums would be then projected up like I am today. So to get it where it is as real as possible, this has been something which has been quite eventful. And I think a lot of the older people have said, quite a lot about the band in the past, and the younger generation, or a small percentage of them, albeit, I thought, well, I've got to go and see this now, because it's the closest I'll ever get. They understand what's been done. They understand the technology. A lot of the older people don't quite get it, how you can do it. But, we are bridging that gap. Obviously, it's something that will never be bridged and be as big as what it was. But, it is a very, very important part of English sort of prog rock history. And whilst I'm not in favor of the word prog rock, we did invent that form of music like you invented jazz. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that people do see it in its best possible form. And this is, the best way you can possibly see it. I believe there's 6 or 7 songs that I play with Greg and Keith, and with Simon and Paul, who have been my band for a long time. We play other stuff. We play the whole of Tarkus, which has all the keyboard sounds in there triggered by guitar, because technology, you could do that as well now. And we play Hodan, and we play Fanfare. So there's a lot in there. So it's a good hour, 45-minute show, and you get the full ball of wax in that period.
It's at the theater at Innovator Square, and I'm looking online, and probably the easiest way to get tickets is you go to carlpalmer.com. That's probably the easiest URL you could ever imagine to have, carlpalmer.com, and you can go grab your tickets.
I believe there's plenty of tickets left. You're a bit slow up in Rochester buying tickets, so, get a move on.
Well, it's 700 seats for Rochester. That's a pretty good venue. The thing is, you hear people's joy in their voices. It's funny. Maybe I'm a little sentimental, but when you talk about this and you talk about your art, and you hear somebody who's living life, on top of the scale there on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I really do appreciate you coming on. Now let me just ask you one last question. Maybe it's another one of those kind of silly questions. Who is Carl Palmer? Who would you, if you said, "Oh, I'm going to introduce you to this fella," How would you define yourself?
I would define myself not as a rock star. I define myself as a working musician, which I've always been. From the day I left school, I've turned professional. And I've been professional ever since. So I would describe myself as a working musician that has had an incredible amount of success, much more than whatever one person should rightfully have when you think of all the bands that I've been in which have been successful. And because of that, I would say that I've been blessed. So I would say that I'm a blessed working musician who happens to be still enthusiastic. And before I got on the phone to you, I'd already practiced for an hour and a half.
Oh, really?
So I'm just dedicated to what I do, because what I do is me. So I'm Carl Palmer, a working musician, and I happen to be a drummer.
Comfortable in your own skin.
Absolutely, 100%.
I am very, very thankful that you gave me this interview. One of the things that I do is I just talk to people. I learn things about people. Every time I talk to somebody, I learn something new, something I didn't know before. And when I had my businesses, I didn't have the time to do any of this. And you make relationships and you get to be friends. And I really do appreciate it. And I'm sure I'll be able to see you when you come here to Rochester. It's a beautiful place.
Please, if you can, if you get time, come back and say hello. You know Bruce Pilata, so he should be able to sort something out for you, and we'll say hi.
Yeah.
Fine,
yeah. No, it certainly would be fun. Would be a lot of fun. Like I said, thank you ever so much. I'm honored, and
thank you. I did appreciate that for the interview. It was a pleasure.
You take care.
Thanks for listening. Tune in every weekend from 10 to 11 on News Radio Wham 1180. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll make more.